British Empire conquered kingdoms across continents, crushed powerful rulers, and built an image of invincibility that history books still repeat today. But there was a time when that empire stood confused, cornered, and humiliated by a civilization it never expected to fear. Long before the Union Jack dominated the Indian subcontinent, British soldiers marched into unfamiliar land, believing discipline and cannons would guarantee victory, only to discover an enemy that refused to fight by European rules. In the rugged hills and vast plains of India, an ancient warrior civilization rose with speed, intelligence, and brutal precision, striking where the British were weakest, vanishing before retaliation, and turning the land itself into a weapon. Officers rode home in disbelief, supplies disappeared overnight, entire columns were trapped without a single decisive battle. And for the first time, the British learned that conquest was not inevitable. This was not a small rebel force or forgotten tribe, but a powerful civilization with its own system of governance. Military strategy and fierce belief in self-rule, guided by leaders who understood that freedom was worth more than empires. This story is not about how the British eventually won, but about the moment they almost lost everything, about the civilization that forced the world's greatest empire to adapt, rethink, and fear defeat. Today we uncover the true story of the Marathas, the warriors, who defied the British Empire and nearly changed the course of history forever. Long before European empires believed the world was theirs to conquer, the Marathas had already built a civilization shaped by resistance, adaptability, and an unshakable sense of freedom. Rising from the rugged Deccan Plateau, they were forged by harsh terrain and constant conflict, which turned mobility into survival and intelligence into power. Unlike centralized empires, the Marathas functioned as a confederacy, bound together by shared purpose rather than rigid hierarchy. Their identity was not defined by glittering palaces or overwhelming numbers, but by speed, discipline, and an intimate knowledge of their land. Fortresses carved into mountains, hidden supply routes, and local intelligence networks allowed them to strike suddenly and vanish without a trace. Leaders like Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaja understood that defeating larger empires required thinking differently. Instead of meeting enemies head-on, the Marathas mastered psychological warfare, weakening opponents before swords ever clashed. Soldiers were trained to move light, travel fast, and fight intelligently rather than gloriously. Every village became a watchpost, every hill a shield, and every road a potential trap. This civilization was not ancient in age alone, but ancient in wisdom, deeply rooted in the belief that power should never be centralized where it can become fragile. By the time the British East India Company began expanding its ambitions, the Marathas were already a hardened force, shaped by generations of resistance, fully prepared to face an enemy that believed itself unstoppable. When the British first encountered the Marathas, arrogance walked alongside their red-coated lines. European victories across the globe had convinced British commanders that discipline, artillery, and formation-based warfare would break any resistance. They believed India would fall the same way others had. What they failed to understand was that the Marathas were not interested in formal battles or symbolic victories. British troops advanced expecting confrontation, only to find empty roads, abandoned camps, and hostile silence. Then the attacks came: swift cavalry charges, supply wagons burning in the night, messengers disappearing without a trace. The Marathas did not fight for spectacle. They fought to exhaust, confuse, and isolate. British officers quickly realized that the enemy they faced was everywhere and nowhere at once. Local populations rarely cooperated with colonial forces, while Maratha intelligence seemed to know British movements before orders were even executed. Soldiers trained for orderly warfare found themselves surrounded by uncertainty, fighting fatigue, fear, and terrain as much as an unseen enemy. Letters sent back to Britain spoke of frustration and disbelief. These were not battles recorded with clear victories or defeats, but campaigns that slowly drained morale. The British presence no longer felt like expansion. It felt like invasion into a land that rejected them entirely. That rejection reached its peak during one of the most humiliating moments in British military history, the events surrounding the Battle of Wadgun. What began as a confident advance deep into Maratha territory soon became a carefully planned nightmare. British forces were lured into narrow mountain paths, where movement was slow and retreat impossible. One by one, supply routes were cut, Food ran out, ammunition dwindled, and reinforcements failed to arrive. The Marathas did not rush the British lines. Instead, they waited, tightening the pressure until desperation set in. Trapped between steep hills and hostile forces, British commanders were forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The eventual surrender shocked Europe. An imperial army, confident and equipped, had been beaten not by overwhelming firepower but by patience, strategy, and total control of terrain. This defeat sent ripples through British leadership and permanently altered how colonial wars were planned. It was no longer enough to dominate through weapons alone. The Marathas had demonstrated that understanding land, people, and timing could destroy even the most disciplined armies. Britain had lost more than a battle, it had lost its illusion of invincibility. The brilliance of the Maratha military lay in how completely it rejected conventional European warfare. They did not believe victory required mass casualties or dramatic confrontations. Instead, their strategy focused on constant pressure, forcing enemies into exhaustion rather than glory. Fast-moving cavalry units could cover extraordinary distances in short periods, attacking supply convoys and vanishing before a response could form. Soldiers carried minimal equipment, relying on local support and deep knowledge of terrain. Communication traveled quickly through informal networks, ensuring commanders knew enemy movements almost instantly. In contrast, British forces depended on long supply lines, heavy artillery, and fixed camps advantages in open fields. Liabilities in hostile territory. The Marathas turned this imbalance into their greatest weapon. British soldiers were forced to defend themselves constantly, eroding morale and discipline. There was no clear battlefield, no clear victory, only an unending state of vulnerability. This form of warfare confused British strategists, who struggled to adapt doctrines built for European conflicts. The Marathas weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting the idea that empire was inevitable. Every successful ambush sent a message louder than cannon fire. Control was an illusion. Despite their strength, the Marathas eventually faced challenges that no enemy army could solve for them. Internal divisions began to weaken unity as competing leaders pursued personal ambition over collective survival. Alliances fractured, command structures clashed, and strategic disagreements slowed decision-making. The British, observant and patient, exploited these fractures carefully. They learned from earlier failures, adapting tactics and investing heavily in intelligence and diplomacy. Local rulers were bribed, rivalries encouraged, and resistance quietly undermined from within. Modernized artillery and reorganized supply systems reduced the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics. Step by calculated step, the British transformed defeat into opportunity. The Marathas still fought fiercely, but no civilization can withstand external pressure indefinitely when unity collapses internally. Their eventual decline was not a sudden fall, but a gradual erosion, accelerated by betrayal, exhaustion, and shifting political realities. The British did not defeat the Marathas through brute strength alone. They waited for the moment when resistance weakened itself. Yet to define the Marathas by their defeat would miss the truth entirely. Their legacy lives far beyond treaties and battlefields. They proved that empires could be challenged, delayed, and humiliated through intelligence rather than obedience. Their methods forced the British Empire to fundamentally rethink colonial warfare, shaping strategies later used across the world. More importantly, they left behind a powerful symbol of self-rule, courage, and resistance that inspired generations to come. The Marathas showed that history does not belong solely to the victors, it belongs to those who dared to fight back. Though the British eventually ruled, they never erased the memory of those who stood in their way. The Maratha civilization did not disappear. It transformed into an idea stronger than borders or armies. An idea that whispered across centuries that freedom is not granted by empires, it is defended by those who refuse to kneel. History often teaches us to remember empires by how much land they conquered, how many flags they planted, or how long they ruled, but it rarely asks us to remember the civilizations that made those empires bleed before they rose to power. The story of the Marathas is not just a chapter in colonial history. It is a reminder that dominance is never absolute, and that resistance, even when it does not end in victory, still shapes the course of the world. The British Empire eventually ruled India, but it did not do so without fear, adaptation, and hard-earned lessons forced upon it by a civilization that simply refused to submit. Long before modern freedom movements, the Marathas proved that courage, strategy, and belief in self-rule could challenge the greatest military machine of its time. Their resistance delayed conquest, shattered myths of invincibility, and left behind a legacy that cannot be erased from history, no matter how often it is overlooked. This was not the story of an empire that vanished, but of a people who stood tall against the tide of imperial ambition and showed the world that power is not measured only by who wins, but by who dares to resist. If stories like this matter to you, stories that reveal hidden truths, forgotten civilizations, and moments when history could have taken a different path, then this channel is for you. Subscribe and become part of a community that looks beyond the surface of history and asks the questions textbooks forget to answer. Share this video with anyone who believes history deserves to be told honestly. And leave a comment below telling us which forgotten civilization, lost empire, or untold resistance story you want uncovered next. Because history isn't just a record of conquest and crowns, it's a record of courage, defiance, and the people who stood up when the world expected them to fall.